Hello and welcome to the Redistricting in Review webinar hosted by Voters Not Politicians Education Fund. My name is Melinda Billingsley and I am the Communications Manager for Voters Not Politicians. Just a few notes before we begin. We are recording this event and the recording can be made available by request. If you have any questions for our panelists, including during their presentations, please just go ahead and submit them using the Q&A function. And if you could include your name and where you're joining us from, we will get to as many questions as we can in the time we have today. And if you are a reporter listening in and you have more questions, please reach out to me at melinda@votersnotpoliticians.com, and I will be happy to schedule a follow-up conversation with you. So with that, I would like to introduce our panelists today. Jamie Lyons-Eddy is the Executive Director of Voters Not Politicians and Voters Not Politicians Education Fund and is a founding member of Voters Not Politicians. Moon Duchin is a founder of the MGGG Redistricting Lab and a prominent academic voice on fair redistricting. She has developed mathematical models to analyze the potential and actual outcomes of changes to policy and voting districts, and has served as an expert in redistricting litigation in Wisconsin, North Carolina, Alabama, South Carolina, Pennsylvania, Texas, and Georgia. And she starts a position as professor of mathematics and public policy at Cornell University this fall after 13 years at Tufts. Moon is also one of the co-authors of the report. And Michael Lee serves as senior counsel for the Brennan Center Democracy Program, where his work focuses on redistricting, voting rights, and elections. He was also the author of a widely cited blog on redistricting and election law issues that the New York Times, called Indispensable. Michael is a regular writer and commentator on election law issues, appearing on PBS NewsHour, MSNBC, and NPR, and in print at the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, and Vox, among others. Moon and Michael, thank you both for joining us this afternoon. And Jamie, I will turn it over to you to get us started.
Thank you so much, Melinda. Thank you to everybody for being here today. I'm just going to reiterate, in case you came in the last minute, that you're welcome to put your questions in the Q&A, and those will be handled at the end after me, and I'll give my presentation, and then Moon, and then Michael, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So thanks so much, everybody, for being here. Here is what I'm going to talk about over the next few minutes. But first, just a little bit about us. Voters Not Politicians came together as a truly grassroots effort back in 2017. Thousands of volunteers across the state of Michigan worked tirelessly before, during, and after the passage of Proposal 18-2. And those volunteers continue to be involved in implementation of Michigan's independent redistricting process today. Among our other democracy work, which grows and expands all the time, we continue to be the defenders and watchdogs of Michigan's independent redistricting process. Because I know we have people here from other states, and shout out to our friends here from Ohio. We're so excited about the movement on redistricting reform in Ohio. I'm going to run through a really quick overview of how our process works here in Michigan. So the commission, which I'll shortcut the name, the Michigan Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission to MICRC, is made up of 13 Michigan citizens, 4 from each major party and 5 who don't affiliate with either of those parties. We tend to refer to these 3 categories, Republican, Democrat, and unaffiliated, as buckets. So you may hear me say that. They are selected through a partially random process in 2 stages with demographic and geographic weighting, and an opportunity for the major parties to strike 10 commissioners each before the final drawing of commissioners. Politicians and their families are excluded from serving. The commission has exclusive authority to adopt congressional and legislative district maps, and all business is required to be conducted in public, including public hearings that are required before and after developing mapping plans. The maps have to follow certain criteria in priority order. So first, federal requirements, including equal population and the Voting Rights Act. Districts must be contiguous. They must reflect Michigan's diverse population and communities of interest. They shall not, exact wording, provide disproportionate advantage to a political party, a candidate, or an incumbent. They shall reflect consideration of county, city, and township boundaries. And lastly, districts have to be reasonably compact. The process for adopting maps, or in the case of the recent redraw, choosing a mapping plan to submit to the court, calls for a majority of commissioners to vote for the mapping plan, including 2 from each of those buckets. If no map meets that requirement, as it didn't during the recent state Senate district redraw, then each commissioner nominates 1 mapping plan for the ranked voting process. After all commissioners rank the available maps, the one with the most points is selected. If at least 2 commissioners outside the sponsor's bucket list the map in the top half of their rankings. Little complicated there. If ranked voting fails, then a mapping plan is selected randomly from those put forward for ranked voting. So that was the overview of the commission and the process. Many of you have probably heard about a court-ordered redraw of certain Michigan legislative districts. That is not the focus of the report that we're here to share today, but I thought that a brief update here would be appropriate. The commission's redrawing of legislative districts in Metro Detroit resulted from the decision in AG v. Benson last December. The plaintiffs in that suit were a group of African-American Detroit residents who sued the MICRC in 2022, alleging that the commission diluted Black voting power in Detroit area districts. That the 3-judge federal panel voided 7 state House districts and 6 state Senate districts on the grounds that the commission violated the Equal Protection Clause. Notably, they did not rule on VRA grounds. The court assigned a reviewing special master to advise the court on the constitutional compliance of the maps, but also appointed a mapping special master to draw maps in the event that the commission failed to do so. After the ruling, the commission worked in 2 sessions to draft a remedial state House and a state Senate plan, and they drafted their initial plans without using race data. After that, their experts provided partisan fairness and VRA analysis before public comment. The commission held multiple in-person public hearings in Detroit and in the Detroit area to gather input. In February, the commission successfully voted for a remedial plan for the Michigan House during their second roll call vote. That mapping plan was approved by the court in March. In June, the commission voted for a Senate remedial plan after 5 rounds of roll call voting and then 1 round of ranked voting, which the Department of State, by the way, handled very well. And that mapping plan was approved by the court just this last Friday. So this outcome, which avoided maps drawn by a special master, is a big win for Michigan voters and really for independent redistricting in general. So we're here to share this report. You should find a link in the chat, and we will also send it to you after the meeting. The report was a collaborative effort between Voters Not Politicians Education Fund and Moon Duchin, who's here with us today. Our objective was to really just review the first cycle of redistricting under Michigan's new citizen-led process to capture lessons learned and make recommendations. The audiences that we had in mind for this report were democracy and voting rights groups here in Michigan, those working to establish or implement independent redistricting in other states, and certainly the next MICRC, which will be a group of 13 citizens that will be seated in 2030, which doesn't seem that far off now, after the next decennial census. One note, this report is not a comprehensive review of implementation efforts by countless community organizations here in Michigan. We have included some information about our own work that we did through Voters Not Politicians Education Fund, and some work done by key partners where it was published and available, but much more work was done that was beyond our scope to identify and record. So one thing, just lastly, I want to emphasize before I turn things over is that our recommendations today should not be misconstrued as any kind of lack of support for the process overall. The process can be improved, and that's what we're here to talk about. But our district maps in Michigan used to be drawn behind closed doors by and for politicians, and this system is infinitely better for voters than that was. We at Voters Not Politicians have an absolute faith in the constitutional amendment that voters overwhelmingly supported across party lines back in 2018. So here is Moon Duchin to summarize what's in the report.
Okay, hello. So let me make sure I've got my screen share operational. Just one moment. Okay, so hi, as you heard, my name is Moon Duchin, and I'm here to talk about the work of my lab, the MGGG Redistricting Lab, in contributing to this evaluation report. And what I'll do is walk through a few elements of the report, particularly the recommendations that we make at the end. So to get started on that, let me make a few stage setting, big picture remarks before diving into some of those recommendations. So one thing is that there is now a proliferation. It was so interesting in this cycle to see how the different commissions operated around the country, and the circumstances were quite different each time. So there's a proliferation of reports that are kind of doing post-mortem evaluation. Ours is a little different than most of the others that I've seen. It's extremely granular and detailed, and it really kind of goes into the weeds of some of how you do the work that these commissions have to do. In particular, we're really interested in how broad principles get operationalized, meaning how do they get turned into something actionable and precise? So we'll think in particular about what is meant by communities of interest and how that should be managed, what that looks like from a data point of view. What is meant by partisan fairness when the Michigan Constitution says that no party shall be favored? How do you make that meaningful? How do you measure it? Beyond that, a big theme that emerges through the process of, that emerged for us through the process of assembling this report is that it really matters how you staff a commission. So this particular instantiation of the Michigan Commission was very inclined to commercial consultants as opposed to academics or think tankers. Many academics and think tankers had roles in the process, including myself, but those were supporting roles, mostly funded externally to the commission operations themselves, and given less weight. And I think some of that happened because of the concern for impartiality. And so thinking that through how we can set up a process that has more different kinds of input possible, that feels like a pretty robust question that's suggested by the study. I'll just mention one more thing. It's interesting timing to have this webinar just as the legal proceedings have concluded, which Jamie mentioned. And those were really interesting, that AGV Benson case. One thing that I want to highlight that seemed very unusual is that both attorneys for the plaintiffs and attorneys for the commission came from kind of Republican aligned litigation entities, and accordingly, kind of their advice throughout the process was aligned in unusual ways, arguing, for instance, for Republican consultants or for academics favored by Republican litigation teams, and giving the litigation a different flavor than I've seen anywhere else in the country. Okay, having said that, let's turn to some of the concrete recommendations that emerged from the report process. These came in a few areas. One was fundamental, which is data availability. This isn't a particularly glamorous thing to focus on, but you can't do any of the work that a commission needs to do without the right data. So here's the bullet pointed suggestions that we made, and I'll just highlight one piece of that, which is that in Michigan, the administration of elections is highly, highly decentralized. It's not the state itself that administers, but localities all over the state, including cities, townships, and so on. And the reporting requirements are extremely weak. So the Department of State, which has to certify elections, actually doesn't even have a lot of the data that would have been needed to better support the work of the commission. And so one way that advocacy groups and policymakers can support the Department of State, and in turn the independent commission, is with reporting requirements that that regulate localities to pass along that information in a modern format promptly. Okay, next area of recommendations was in staffing and hiring. And so here I'll come back to the theme I highlighted before, who helps out the commission turns out to be quite important. One thing that I noticed in looking around the country at other bodies that drew lines is that some of them had a person in a role of coordinating advisor, and that seems like a key element of success, to have someone who's kind of serving as a quarterback for the whole process, and that helping, as the name implies, coordinate all the other elements of support teams. And so there's some suggestions in particular that go along with that, but in particular, coming back to that earlier theme, managing the kind of partisan tug of war on the hiring process seems really important from the outset. This commission regarded people who had political experience as potentially tainted by that political experience, or having a harder time appearing or being impartial. And that led to situations where some of the key staff had no experience with redistricting, and that arguably caused some problems down the line. So thinking through that kind of tension between experience and impartiality seems pretty important, and finding someone that earns the trust of the whole commission to serve as coordinating advisor seem to be in line with best practices around the country. Okay, next, partisan fairness. So that was a really important element of the commission's work, constitutionally mandated, as you heard. And ultimately, the commission considered 3 scores mainly. Scores called the mean median score, the efficiency gap, and lopsided margins, which is a little less famous than the other 2. So the recommendations that we made here largely have to do actually with transparency. So the data that was used to create these scores was never made public by the commission, and that made it very difficult for groups trying to follow along with the process and support the commission and its work to have a view in how to do that. Relatedly, the commissioners themselves were presented with these scores, told that in all cases 0 is an ideal score, but not given ranges or kind of thoughts about how much is too much. And so the mere presence of scores doesn't really solve the problem of partisan fairness, especially when you're trying to balance it with other concerns. Moving on, I'll show you this plot that my lab was able to put together for this recent set of state Senate plans. We just tried as best as we could to reconstruct what the commission was using for its decisions. And here's a plot showing how a small range of plans that were in consideration for the Senate performed in a range of elections in terms of the number of seats that would have been given to each side. Just to say that it's certainly possible to try to put partisan fairness scores in context, but you really need a little bit more of a view into exactly how they're being computed for the commission and on the basis of what data in order to do that. Otherwise, you're doing a reconstruction effort that really increases the degree of difficulty. Okay, minority opportunity and racial fairness, opportunity to elect, is a major issue, obviously, facing the commission. A tension was perceived by the commission between Black electoral opportunity in and around Detroit on one hand, and their really high primacy on partisan balance on the other. And you could wonder if that tension is real, if it's fundamental, if those things really work at odds with each other. In the end, our recommendations about race and redistricting largely have to do with training and outreach. So a major recommendation is stronger and earlier training on the VRA and on equal protection, constitutional elements of this complicated equation of race and redistricting. If stronger training occurs earlier, that can help cultivate some judgment on the part of the commissioners themselves about this balance and how to weigh factors against each other. And then communities of interest. So this time around, the commission conducted a lively real-time experiment in data-driven community mapping. And here I can tell you about that in some detail because my lab was contracted by the Department of State to help with this effort. And so that was, we produced a data set and made it fully public that I think will be of great interest to researchers trying to think about what communities look like on the ground around Michigan, but it's not clear how much that was ultimately used by the commission. And so one of the recommendations that came out of thinking about that process was that instead of just having a web tool that people can visit to draw their communities of interest, to have a more mediated intake process where some intake specialists can help with a kind of interview process as people try to express themselves in a form that will be useful for the commission in its decision making. Okay, these are just some images from the community of interest process and some links, which I'm happy to share in the chat and afterwards, if people want to see some details on all the thousands of submissions that were collected from around the state through the intake process. I have to say that the commissions in California and Michigan both had the nation's strongest and most robust, most expansive community of interest intake processes. So I think that was a strong point. And then finally, the mapping process itself. So there's this massive investment of effort, of time and effort by the citizen commissioners, and how should their brains and good faith and hard work best be used? We have a variety of suggestions about that, but in particular, what we observed from watching many hours of footage was that the commissioners spent a long time actually sitting at a computer, you know, with a mouse or the equivalent, drawing lines. And we ended up wondering if their expertise earned over this long haul process might have been better leveraged in deliberative decision-making about high-level principles rather than actually sort of moving the pixels around on a screen to draw the lines. So there, I think, is an interesting high-level question about how to make best use of all that engagement and all the knowledge amassed by the commissioners. Okay, and so these are some highlights among a big range of recommendations. And you already heard, and you have available to you in the chat, a link to the report. So I'll stop there and I look forward to questions later. Great, so I'll hand it off to Michael.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michael Lee from the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law, and a big fan of the redistricting process at Michigan, which we were very pleased to help advise on when it was being proposed, and have very closely watched it as it's become really a model for the rest of the country. That that when people now talk about wanting to change redistricting in their state, one of the first states that they always go to is Michigan. And I think I love the fact that this report is coming out. In California, they did something very similar, although that came from the commission after the California Commission was set up to draw maps in the 2010 cycle, and then the commissioners wrote their own report about here are things that we thought could be different going forward. And it is always important to learn because these are new. They're relatively few independent commissions. Only 4 states have what we consider to be independent commissions, in addition to California and Michigan, Arizona and Colorado, and they're all different. And they were all set up at different times, and they learn from each other. And I think it's always good to see what worked and what didn't work. In addition to a couple of the possible changes that Moon mentioned, I'll just throw out 2 that seem important. One is, I do think it is worth considering whether the way that the Michigan commissioners are selected, which is purely by random. I mean, there's weighting of the pools, but then the draw is completely random. There is no qualitative screening as in other states, to make sure that people are, people who would be good commissioners, who have like real relevant life experience and familiarity with communities, and a record of working together with people and the like, and have the right temperament. And likewise, there is no qualitative screening before the pools are created, and that puts Michigan a little bit at odds with both California and newer reforms like the proposed reform in Ohio. And that's something I think that's worth looking into. It does require finding somebody that you trust to run that process. But if you look at both California and Ohio, they've managed to sort of like figure ways out that I think really cabin a lot of the gaming concerns that a lot of people have on that. And, I think those tend to produce, they tend to bring extra value there. It does take a little longer to put that together, but it can be really important in making sure that you don't get sort of commissioners who, meet a list of they're not disqualified, but they may not be qualified, and so that's something I think that is important to consider. Another thing to think through, and it's been interesting as we've gone around the country and talked to commissioners. I think that one thing that is clear is like when you look at how commissioners actually read some of the criteria, and it's like, oh wait, that's not how I would read it, or that's not how a lawyer would read it. I think that there, I've come to see that there are ways that things could be clearer. For example, communities of interest. If you look at the proposed Ohio reform, there is a much more robust definition of what is a community of interest and standards for what you do when communities of interest overlap, as they invariably do, because we all belong to different communities of interest. Any given neighborhood will be part of several different communities of interest, and which one has greater priority. And Ohio makes an effort at trying to sort that out and kind of help the commission, when there are conflicts, decide which one to prioritize. And so, that is an example of how I think the criteria might be clarified. I also think that there could be some greater clarity around how the partisan fairness metric works, and what its relationship is to the other criteria. But then also, what do things like disproportionate advantage mean? Because I think, looking back, that can be something that is subject to widely different interpretation. And I think if you're writing constitutional language, one thing that you can do is you can be more prescriptive. If what you really want is something that is close to X or proportionality or whatever, you can write it in that way, and that will help the commission do its work, and not sort of, because the one thing you'll find is that people will find people to say something means whatever they want it to mean. And so I think to avoid that kind of conflict, and again, I think the commission got it right. I do think it got it right, but one thing when we've talked to commissioners around the country is it's something that they struggled with, right? And they don't quite know what it is, and they feel like they have to go to experts, and then the experts sometimes don't always say the same thing, and that's very hard. And so that's one example of how I think you might sort of make that better. But overall, I think this is a very good process, and it continues to be a model for the rest of the country. Now, I will say just a few things about the litigation in Michigan, which I think is also important. And I think there are a lot of positive lessons that you can learn from that. And that might seem strange because, somebody sued on the maps were struck down and then they were redrawn. And so, what positive lessons could you have from that? And I think what is important to remember is that judicial review is an important part of the redistricting process everywhere. Overall around the country, there have been about 84 cases challenging congressional or legislative maps, or both. A lot of those are still pending, and there are and they're stuck. Whereas Michigan is done, and there are lots of reasons why these cases are, in most cases involving redistricting plans, are still pending, despite the fact that we're halfway through the decade. And an important one is that in most states, lawmakers who draw the maps hide behind things like a legislative privilege to try to hide their discussion. So it's really hard to figure out what their intent was or what happened. The Michigan Commission, everything was very transparent. There was a very robust record of tens of thousands of pages. You actually have verbatim transcripts of what commissioners said. You can read it to your heart's content. And that made reviewing the maps much easier because it was very clear and very detailed. So the court was able to do its job in reviewing the maps, and it found that there were some problems with the maps and ordered them to be fixed. And that's happened. Whereas in many other states like Texas and Florida, and elsewhere, it's not clear that the maps will be fixed even in time for the 2026 election. They may not even be fixed in time for the 2028 election. And that is really quite appalling because ultimately, it doesn't mean much if the maps are struck down in 2029, and then you only get to vote in one election under new maps. I think there's also a really great lesson for reformers around the country and like how the commission responded when the maps were struck down. And again, that's night and day from what happened in other states like Alabama, Ohio, Louisiana, and Florida. In Alabama, the state got ordered to create a second Black majority district. It didn't. It just simply passed a map in a very defiant fashion that did not create such a district. And the court had to step in and impose its own map. In Ohio, the Ohio Supreme Court repeatedly struck down both the legislative and congressional maps. It didn't have the power to put its own map in place, and the map drawing bodies in Ohio simply passed more gerrymandered maps. And although they got better over time, they still are not fair maps. Likewise in Louisiana, the state has dragged its foot on drawing new maps. You may not get maps now until 2025. In Florida, litigation is still dragging out for the Florida Supreme Court. It's unclear when that will be resolved. And in Texas, there is actually no trial date as of yet on maps that are highly discriminatory. And so, not only do you get litigation resolved more quickly when you have a commission, but the commission tends to respond more in good faith. And I think that is really important. And that is, in fact, par for the course. Commissions do get their maps challenged, not as often as legislatively drawn maps, but when they do, they respond much, much better, which is, not to say that this process wasn't painful for people involved. It was. But I think that one thing is very clear when you read the record, both before the lawsuit and after. Everyone here was acting in good faith and trying to get it right. They were trying to grapple with a particularly hard question about how you apply the VRA in a place like Detroit, where the facts on the ground are more complicated than in the South, and where a lot of the data that you would want from a legal standpoint to help you assess what is required simply wasn't available. But again, I think Michigan is very much a model and has been and continues to be. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you as well, Moon and Jamie, for your presentations. As a reminder to our attendees, if you have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A function. Jamie, I'm actually going to start with you for this first question. So should the Michigan legislature pass laws to improve the redistricting process?
So generally when I'm asked that question, my answer is generally no. As somebody who organized 4,000 people to go collect signatures to end the process that was controlled by the legislature, our general feeling is keep the legislature out of this process. And I continue to feel that way for the most part, except I will note that the first bullet point recommendation in this report that Moon talked about was to put some sort of regulations in place so that uniform data is available from all of the counties in Michigan to support this process and other processes, honestly. This very decentralized system that we have here in Michigan really, you've heard it from all of us, really prevents this commission from being able to do its work the way it needs to. So that's the one exception where I think probably we do need a legislative solution to make it work better.
Thank you. Michael, I'll go to you for this next question, which comes from Mary, who is actually one of our BNP volunteers, so helped get this whole process in place. What needs to be done to blend the constitutional requirement for both race blindness, the Equal Protection Clause, as well as VRA requirements, specifically when we're looking at, future MICRC deliberations?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, Michigan is a hard state to sort of try to figure out what is required, and it's hard for a couple of reasons. One is, it is, you have, it's not clear that you necessarily have VRA liability in at least all of even Metro Detroit. And then there are disputes about what is required if you do have VRA liability to remedy it. And it's hard because the data is not necessarily clear. There is a lot of crossover voting, at least in parts of Michigan and parts of Metro Detroit, where white voters are perfectly willing to form coalitions with black voters and elect a shared candidate of choice. But that's not the case everywhere. And you don't have sort of a lot of racially contested elections that sort of allow you to sort of see whether black voters have a clearly different choice from white voters in the primary, for example, or for that matter, in the general election. And so it can be hard to sort of figure out whether you have liability. And then, and again, the VRA liability is determined sort of area by area. Like you might have it on one side of Detroit, but not on the other side of Detroit. And so that those things sort of make it hard. But then what do you do to remedy it, right? In the South, for example, it's very clear if you're talking in Texas, it's very clear that, unless a district is say 60% Latino or something like that, it's not going to perform to elect a Latino preferred candidate given, disparities in voter turnout and given the high rates of racial polarization. Politics in the South are very much divided along racial and ethnic lines. And that's not clear everywhere in Detroit. And so, there are places where, maybe a 45% black district is perfectly good. And there are other places where it's not. And I think, that kind of does make it hard. I wouldn't quite describe the, so the rule is not that you have to be colorblind, right? And like that is never, there's been in Michigan, there was a little bit sort of an interpretation of the fact that you must be colorblind. And that's actually not the rule. It is that you can consider race, it just cannot predominate. It can be a consideration among many others. It just cannot predominate. If it does, in fact, it also can predominate, right? Like it can predominate if, for example, you have a good faith reason to believe that you have to do this to comply with the Voting Rights Act, right? And so, if you had VRA liability, then there would be less problem. But the question, it was unclear whether you had VRA liability, and so that makes it hard. I think what ultimately will be helpful for the commission is to sort of like really develop robust sort of community of interest understandings, right? Because the rule is basically if we're trying to tell people what the rule is, who weren't lawyers, I would say like, look, you can't just put black people in a black district because they're black and assume that their number one priority is being with other black people. But you can put black people in a district, where they have, they're part of a recognizable community of interest that they support, that they recognize as a community of interest that has lots of shared socio and economic interests beyond racial considerations. And so developing robust community of interest evidence, both, from public input, which is very important, but also from, other sorts of metrics, and things can be really helpful, because then it, if somebody argues you are destroying district on the basis of race, that's, not it. So
I wanted to just jump in. So I agree with much of what Michael's saying, but just from my perspective, as someone who's served as an expert in VRA cases, including the one in Alabama that we've been mentioning, I just want to, something might not quite be clear to people who aren't in the expert weeds that I think is really helpful to support Michael's point. Why is it that we keep saying things were unclear or we didn't have the data? So just, this comes back to this point about the Michigan Department of State was literally unable to provide primary election data. It literally said, we don't have it. Now, of course, they certify those elections, but matching the election returns to geography is what you need to do this analysis. So to Mary's question very specifically, one thing I would say is a really important mechanism people use to balance race consideration with equal protection is not to talk about the percent of Black people in a district. As Michael said, that's not a very good way to gauge its effectiveness. Instead, you want to use past election results, because that encompasses the crossover voting patterns and so on that Michael was talking about. But in the Detroit area, all the action is in the Democratic primary. And if you look at the cases where Black incumbents were defeated in the new maps, or where there was some controversy around the lack of Black representation, that action was happening in the primary. But the commission just wasn't able to take a close look at past primary races because they didn't have the data. So I just wanted to put a really concrete, nitty-gritty, like expert perspective on why was it so unclear and why was it so hard. And I'll just add one thing. The commission ultimately, in the redrawing process triggered by the legal decision, they ultimately did assemble primary data, but they did not make it public. So this is something where we can push for transparency and ask the commission to make that public so that, watchdogs and boosters for their work can see what it is that they ultimately did do in the end to decide that they had adequately taken into account Black opportunity to elect. We cannot audit that until they make that primary data public, and I hope that they will.
Thank you, Moon, and you as well, Michael. Moon, I'm going to keep it with you for a second here. The next question I have is, are there better ways that future commissions can evaluate the partisan fairness of mapping plans under consideration? We'd love to just have that very concrete answer to something that our commission this time kind of struggled with.
Sure. Yeah, no, I think measuring partisanship is made complex by the fact that Michael mentions this key intuitive fairness principle that a lot of people hold as their sort of common sense understanding of partisan balance is proportionality, which means if you get a certain share of the votes, you should get about that share of the seats. That's proportionality. And for many people, that's kind of second nature as a definition of partisan balance. If Republicans got 60% of the votes in the state, they should probably get about 60% of the seats. But interestingly, nowhere in the country is that part of the actual legal framework around redistricting, except in Ohio, where it is mentioned in the Constitution, but it was ignored in the cycle so far in the redistricting process. So one thing, and this comes back to the point I made during showing you the bullets, which is that we should leverage the wisdom of commissioners by asking them about principles and how they'd like to operationalize them. So I'll give just a quick example. I had the honor of advising the Wisconsin People's Maps Commission. Now, this wasn't an empowered commission in Wisconsin. It was kind of a shadow commission set up by the governor to provide a model for how citizen redistricting might look in Wisconsin. And the very first thing that commission did was sit down and say, okay, what should we mean by partisan fairness? And so I, as an advisor, presented them with a bunch of definitions and said, why don't you deliberate and vote on the one that you'd like to use and how you'd like to do it? And so in that case, the support of a consultant who knows the definitions really well and who understands how to put the data together can present a menu of choices for the commission, and they can then have a values-based deliberation and come to their idea of how they'd like to operationalize something. So this kind of goes hand in glove with something that Michael said earlier, which is that legal language can be made more prescriptive and more specific. That's definitely true. But that's tricky, especially if you're amending the state constitution to put things in quantitatively specific terms that will still look reasonable in 50 years. That's very hard. It's not impossible, but it's very hard. So some of that gap can be filled by deliberation of the commissioners if they're given a kind of knowledgeable rundown of their choices. So, for instance, you could have chosen efficiency gap and tried to keep it between, minus 0.07 and 0.07. There's a menu of options that people have found successful in different states. And I think that using the opportunity to talk about pros and cons and then zero in on something that you decide on kind of, ex ante, and then guides you throughout the process. That's probably something like best practices for dealing with partisan fairness.
So not to put too fine a point on this, but it sounds like what you're saying, Moon, is when you talk about the commission, instead of spending time quote unquote pen in hand doing the mapping, these kind of deliberations would be better use of time and can help in making those decisions.
Well, I saw it work really well in Wisconsin. And of course, to be fair, since they're not an empowered commission, they didn't have anything like the public pressure and scrutiny. And so maybe that made it easier to do this kind of work. But by having early conversations about how to turn their ideas and values into metrics and thresholds, that really framed their work in a very productive way. And it seemed really helpful down the line. What it also, let us do down the line is have rounds of mapping and kind of improve from one round to the next by the lights of the metrics selected by the commission themselves.
Awesome, thank you. Gonna switch gears a little bit here because we have our partners from across the country present on the call. We have a question from the League of Women Voters of Ohio, who we know are currently working with their next constitutional amendment. And this question is for both Michael and Moon. So I will start with Moon on this one, I think. Do you think that Ohio's data management in terms of their election data is better and therefore might not run into those same challenges that we have here in Michigan?
It is not better. And here's how I know. This cycle in Ohio, or it hasn't been better, and that may change. And actually it's possible that the reporting is going to change kind of through the process of this constitutional amendment, which would be fantastic. But I can tell you this, there's a politician commission in Ohio right now. When they set up to do their work and figure out this kind of statewide precinct shapefile with election results attached, they actually called my lab for help. So I can tell you that the data, at least as of a couple of years ago, was such that the state, just like in Michigan, did not have statewide results compiled into a shapefile. But we were able to help in that case because we had called all 88 counties in Ohio to collect that data as of a few years prior. So it's just, there's this enormous amount of invisible, unglamorous work that you have to do to put together statewide geography and elections when there's not a strong reporting requirement. So, if you leave, from my point of view, if you leave this call with one idea about making the whole system better, it's that localities who can change the boundaries of their precincts from day to day for very local granular reasons need to be able to report that in a digitized format to the state so that this kind of information doesn't become, a firewall between citizens and an understanding of their political maps.
Thank you. I think we've got a little bit of this answer during the presentations, but I just really want to make it clear. So I'm going to address this one to you, Jamie. How do you think the fact that the court did order a redraw of parts of the legislative maps in Michigan, how does that reflect on Michigan's process overall?
Well, I mean, it actually, if you look back at some of the recommendations in the report, there are connections back to hiring and staffing and training on the VRA process. I do think there were other challenges that failed. This was the first one first challenge to the maps or to the process that did result in any sort of order from the court. I think what's important to see here is that we have to think back. The court originally was so skeptical that the commission could handle doing this redraw that they assigned somebody to draw backup maps, which fortunately did not become necessary. And the commission and the process both rose to this occasion and got the job done. So I think it speaks to a robust process that it even increases my faith in it. And the other thing that I think was notable during the redraws is how much we were able to learn, how much all of us in Michigan, those of us who work the nonprofits and democracy organizations that work on implementation around the state, I think the people who administer the commission, the public, everybody got to learn a lot more through this process. And fortunately, we were successful, and we have maps that hopefully will be used now until the next go around after the census in 2030.
And I think everybody
Michael,
also,
where do you...
I was just going to add to what JB said. It's like, I think everybody, like it is not unusual, like for the first time go when you have a commission that, there are some teething pains, right? That you sort of learn how to do this. And, this one was particularly hard, I think, because of course it occurred during the pandemic, right? And so you're having to do all of this during the pandemic with the census data coming in late and then not being able to travel around and meet with people around the state in the same way that you might want to otherwise. And, I think the one thing that is very clear from the record, both when drawing the original maps and then but also when drawing the new maps, is how hard the commissioners really worked and how much they really participated in good faith in the process. And I think, I could perfectly understand why people might not want to watch every hour of very long proceedings. I've watched several days of it myself recently, and it's a lot. But if you do watch them or some of it or read the transcripts, you really do get a sense of like this is how the process is supposed to work, right? It is very much night and day from when lawmakers draw maps and they start the process, or very political people draw maps and they start the process with the end goal in mind, and they figure out what they need to do to get to that end goal. And here, the commission really sort of, wrestled with this stuff and struggled with it. And I think that should be very inspiring, because these were everyday Michiganders who came together and did this. And Michigan has had some of the best maps. It still has some of the best maps in the country in terms of fairness at all different levels.
And I'll just jump in to say that the pages and pages of transcripts that were quoted in the court decision is the antithesis of the way this has been done in the past. I mean, there was a trail of every single conversation and every single decision, and that transparency is in the best interest of Michigan voters for sure.
If anyone wants to go back and look through just with this redraw, I think Voters Not Politicians staff and volunteers watched about almost 300 hours of redistricting deliberations. So if you're really interested, it's all still there and publicly available. And isn't that wonderful?
It is wonderful. And you get to if you get to learn about parts of Michigan that you may not be from, right? And it's very interesting. I mean, I learned a lot about Detroit in the redraw. So
Michael, I think I've got time to ask you at least one more question, which is Voters Not Politicians used a constitutional amendment to create their redistricting commission. And we see the same process happening right now with our friends in Ohio. So do you think that using these constitutional changes is the best way to create redistricting reform in other states? And attached to that, where should national redistricting advocates be turning their attention to next? Where would the next opportunity be?
Well, I think in states where you have a direct path to the ballot, it can be very effective, because it used to be that redistricting reform amendments failed, right? People just this seems strange, it would fail, but now you put it on the ballot, and even if it's not a particularly well-designed reform, it passes, right? And because people recognize that something is very much broken. And I think now you also have evidence from Michigan, and Colorado and other states this is a pretty good process, right? And before it was California, and who wants to be like California, right? California is different; they're weird, and not in a sort of I realize weird has become kind of a political word now, but weird in the from a month ago what we meant by that. But I think where you have a direct path to the ballot, it can be really powerful, and you see that in Ohio, where people are ready to sign, and I expect that it will pass there. I think in other states, Florida, of course, is a big one. If it's complicated. For any number of reasons, which are too lengthy to get into here. But, Florida is a big state that, has a number of problems where you could create an independent commission. There were nascent efforts in a number of states, Arkansas, Nebraska, and other states before the pandemic, and people just weren't able to collect the signatures and put it on the ballot. Illinois is another possibility where Democrats have traditionally gerrymandered. But the Illinois Supreme Court keeps kicking the amendments off the ballot for this or that reason. But it is a path, at least in half the states that allow ballot initiatives. For the rest of the country, you're going to probably have to do something different. And it may require for congressional redistricting, congressional action, right? You know, and I think, and that's particularly true in the South because there aren't many direct paths to the ballot in the South, and that's where you have some of the worst gerrymanders. So, but you know, you could solve a lot of the problem where, you know, in these states, and then that creates pressure on elsewhere. Because again, you know, I think people look at Michigan and they say, like, I really want to have what Michigan has, you know, and it's, I know, like, you know, like I've had people in Ohio say, like, we want that. And like, you know, you know that it must be very good for somebody in Ohio saying, I want something from Michigan, because that doesn't usually happen that way. And for them to say, you know, Michigan has something that we would want, you know, does tell you how great the Michigan reforms, you know, through all the growing pains have been.
I think we'll put that on some VNP merch, like so good, even Ohio wants it. I'd like to think I've got time for just one more question, which I'm going to send this one to Moon, and Jamie, feel free to follow up. And that is, do outside groups like advocacy groups, Voters Not Politicians being one of them, have a role to play in the redistricting process as it happens? And what kind of role is appropriate and helpful for these advocacy groups to take?
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, I say this, you know, not just because this is a call with you all, but I think VNP did just extraordinary work in this cycle, in particular being a prime mover behind getting the commission formed, but then also just sort of helping out in 1,000 ways. I think I watched some of VNP's mobilization efforts, getting people to participate, signing memoranda of understanding, MOUs with community groups. I thought that was such a model that we put an example into the report in an appendix so you can see what it looks like to create an MOU that gets community groups activated to have people contribute their feedback and their time and energy to connecting with the process. You know, and by the way, it really showed. I was involved in input collection efforts in several states. And for instance, the New Mexico Commission, I also worked with them to collect public input, and Michigan got something like 10 to 100 times the volume of input that New Mexico did. No, it's a bigger state, but not that much bigger. And so that really speaks to the success of not just VNP, but that's just the effort I saw most up close. But that just speaks to sort of how much more you can sort of do to make the work of a commission meaningful by connecting it with what people want and what people kind of people are watching the work of a commission, and when they feel that they can engage directly, that's very, very positive. There's one other thing I wanted to, so let me ask Jamie if she has anything to add to that, but then there's one other question from the Q&A that I at least want to just call out and acknowledge. But Jamie, did you want to add anything about outside groups?
Go ahead.
Okay, great. So I just saw this one question in the Q&A that I at least wanted to address. And that question came from Marjorie, who asked, with respect to the primary data, even if we had the data, it's hard to imagine how any commission could draw a district in which multiple candidates run, say 5 or more, and split the vote in a way that splits votes for ethnic minority candidates and leads to a victory by one other. What do you recommend to solve that problem? Maybe ranked choice voting. That was the question. And so this probably sounds familiar to those who are closely watching the situation in and around Detroit, because of course there's a district, I think it's District 13, in which is now represented by Shri Thanadar, who is an Indian American candidate, was an Indian American candidate, now elected, who got about 28% of the vote in the primary, and the other 72% was split among 7 Black candidates, I believe it was. And so, you know, you could rightly wonder whether that's something that the actual drawing of the boundary lines has anything to do with, right? And I just wanted to address that very, very briefly 2 ways. And one is to say it's true, right? It's clear that those supporting Black candidates had 70+% of the votes. And therefore, had there been fewer candidates to split the vote or a more coordinated effort by voters to concentrate their votes, that the same boundaries would have performed differently. That's absolutely true. And just my two feelings about that. One, the earlier that lines are drawn, the better that parties and advocacy groups can get organized around candidates. What we saw in the French election recently, which was encouraging some to withdraw so as not to split the vote. That takes time and organization. So the earlier that line drawing work is done, the easier that is. But Marjorie, I completely agree with the other thing you said, which is that other mechanisms like ranked choice voting do mitigate vote splitting and make it so that it's not quite as easy to have a 72% majority end up losing out. So both and is my answer to that. I'd be interested if Michael or Jamie had any thoughts on that vote splitting and mechanisms of election question as well.
Well, we are actually at 4 o'clock, so I just want, in case people have to jump off, which I know I'm sure some people do. I would like to wrap up, and then if Michael does have something to say, we can do that. You're welcome to jump in there afterward. But I just wanted to thank everybody so much for coming. Special thanks to both Moon and Michael, who this is just one little example of how much your expertise, both of you, has been invaluable, both to Voters Not Politicians and to the state of Michigan as a whole. You've been champions of this process and deeply involved all the way through, and thank you so very much. And then I also just want to reiterate that though we were here and the report centers on improvements that can be made, that we are so proud of the constitutional amendment that ended gerrymandering and turned Michigan's redistricting process over to our citizens. We're going to continue to work on refining that process, but we're thrilled to have maps drawn by voters, not politicians. So we're only going to be able to use that for so long. So I just want to thank everybody for coming. Have a wonderful afternoon. And if you do want to stick around to hear if Michael has anything more to say about splitting, please feel free to do that.
I
You're kind of
will
on the
just-
spot, Michael. You're going to have to